I am grateful you chose to spend this time here. Tell me in the comments. What city? What country are you watching from tonight? You might be surprised how many people around the world are sitting with the same story. Note: some elements of this story are fictional, added to serve the telling. Names and settings are not drawn from any specific person or place, but the lesson inside them is. Choose the content that serves you. And if this one does, stay. The first thing I noticed when I turned onto Montfort Avenue that Friday evening was the cars. There were 5 of them parked along the curb in front of my house. A black Lexus, 2 late-model Audis, a white Range Rover, and something low and silver that I could not identify from that distance, but that probably cost more than I earned in a year restoring other people's furniture. I pulled my truck to the far end of the block where the street bends slightly toward Pearson Drive and sat there with the engine idling, looking at those cars the way you look at something that does not belong in a picture you have been living inside for 30 years. I turned off the ignition and sat a little longer. The white oak in the front yard had started turning. The outermost leaves had gone copper and burnt orange overnight, the way they always do in early October in Asheville. Quietly, without asking permission. I had planted that tree the spring Della and I moved in, 1993. It was barely taller than my hip back then, a sapling I had picked up from a nursery out on Sweeten Creek Road for $11, because Della said a house without a tree in the yard was just a building with walls. Now the branches reached past the second-floor windows. And on evenings like this one, the last of the October light caught the leaves in a way that made the whole front of the house look like it was holding something warm inside it. The house itself was a Queen Anne. 4 bedrooms, 2 stories. The kind of place Montfort was built on. Gambrel roof, shingle siding, a wide front porch with turned columns that I had replaced one by one over a decade. As the originals rotted from the inside out, I had built this house the way a man builds anything worth keeping. Not all at once, not in a straight line, but piece by piece, board by board. Starting from the foundation I poured myself in the summer of 1991 and finishing with the last piece of crown molding in the upstairs hallway 3 years later. Every joint in that frame I had cut by hand. Every floorboard I had measured twice and cut once and laid flat with the grain running east to west because Della had read somewhere that the morning light moved better across wood when the grain ran with the sun. She had been right. She was right about most things. I got out of the truck, locked it, and walked toward the front door. I could hear the music before I reached the porch steps, something electronic and rhythmic. The kind that fills a room with sound without actually saying anything. And underneath it, laughter. The bright, polished kind of laughter that people produce when they are performing for each other. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room, my living room, with the heart pine floors I had salvaged from a church demolition in Black Mountain back in 2004, and the built-in bookshelves I had constructed from reclaimed chestnut because Della said factory shelves had no soul, was full of strangers. 8 of them, maybe 10. Men in slim-cut jackets with the sleeves pushed up. Women in dresses that probably had labels I had never heard of. Somebody had moved the coffee table against the wall to make room. There were wine glasses on every flat surface, including the windowsill where Della used to keep her small terracotta pots of rosemary and thyme. The pots were gone. I did not know when that had happened. The air smelled like cologne and something floral that came from a candle I had never seen before, sitting on the mantelpiece where Della's carved wooden clock had been for 26 years. The clock was gone too. I looked at the space where it had been and felt something shift inside me. The way a house shifts when the foundation settles unevenly. Not a collapse, just a quiet rearrangement of weight that changes the way every door in the building swings. My daughter Sophie was standing near the fireplace beside a man I recognized as Garrett Townsend. She was holding a glass of white wine and smiling with the practiced ease of someone who has spent the evening being the center of attention and has grown comfortable in it. Garrett stood beside her with his arm resting on the mantel, exactly where Della's clock had been. And he was talking to an older couple I had never seen before. His parents, I assumed. The Townsends. They had the particular posture of people who are accustomed to being in rooms that belong to them. Sophie saw me come in. Something moved across her face. Not guilt. Something closer to mild inconvenience. The expression of a person who has forgotten to account for a variable and is now adjusting in real time. She said something quietly to Garrett, set her glass on the mantel, and crossed the room toward me. Not quietly enough. Not carefully enough. 3 or 4 of her guests glanced over as she moved, and I understood from the way their eyes tracked her that my arrival had been noticed and was being assessed. I was still holding the gift I had brought. It was under my arm, wrapped in a moving blanket. The way I always transported finished pieces. 3 months of work. A hand-carved chair, black walnut, with a lattice back I had designed from a pattern Della had sketched in a notebook 15 years ago. She had drawn it one afternoon while sitting in the workshop watching me work, just a quick pencil sketch on the back of an envelope, and I had kept it in the drawer of my bench ever since. When Sophie announced her engagement, I had taken that sketch out and built the chair from it. Every joint hand-cut. Every curve shaped with a spokeshave that had belonged to my father. The seat was contoured to the exact measurements I had taken from Sophie's old reading chair when she was not home, so that when she sat in it, it would feel as though it had been made for her. Because it had. She reached me at the edge of the living room, near the hallway that leads to the kitchen. Her voice came out at full conversational volume, not a whisper, carrying just far enough to reach the nearest cluster of guests. "Dad." She glanced at my hands, at the blanket-wrapped shape under my arm, at the sawdust on my jacket that I had not had time to brush off. Her expression shifted into something I had not seen before. Not embarrassment exactly. Something more practiced than that. She stopped about 2 feet from me, close enough that I could smell the perfume she was wearing. Something I did not recognize. Something that did not smell like anything that had ever existed in this house before Garrett Townsend entered it. "Hey, Dad. You're home early." She said it the way a person says something that is not a greeting but a correction, a recalibration of timing. I was not supposed to be here yet. I understood that now. "I've been at the shop since 7 this morning," I said. She nodded once. The kind of nod a person gives when they are not listening but need the other person to stop talking so the next thing can happen. Then she looked down at my hands, openly, without any attempt to disguise what she was doing. My hands. The same hands that had built the frame she was standing inside of. The calluses along the right palm from 45 years of holding chisels and planes. The sawdust under the fingernails that never fully comes out no matter how long you scrub. The thin scar across my left thumb from a slip with a draw knife in 1983, the year she was born. She looked at those hands the way a person looks at something that has arrived in the wrong room. "Look," she said. And the word came out at full volume. Not lowered. Not careful. "You've got sawdust all over your jacket. And your hands, Dad, the smell. It follows you when you've been working all day. It's just..." She paused, glanced back at the room. I watched 2 of Garrett's parents register the exchange. His mother turned her head slightly. His father looked at me once and then looked away with the practiced disinterest of a man who has decided that what he is seeing is not worth the effort of an opinion. "It's a whole thing, Dad." Sophie kept her voice light, conversational, as though she were explaining something obvious to someone who simply had not thought it through. "You look more like a handyman than someone who actually lives here." Behind her, the older couple, Garrett's parents, had moved closer. The woman wore a cream-colored jacket and a strand of pearls that sat against her collarbone with the quiet authority of something that had been inherited rather than purchased. She was looking at me with polite curiosity, the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they have not yet decided whether to keep. "And who is this?" she asked, directing the question at Sophie rather than at me. Sophie turned. I watched her assemble the sentence before she said it. The way you watch a crack form in a piece of wood. Slowly at first. Then, all at once. "Oh, this is my dad." She waved one hand lightly in my direction without quite looking at me. "He does some woodwork. Fixes old chairs and things. He's basically the caretaker here." She laughed. It was a small laugh, almost nothing. The kind that is designed to make a sentence land softer than it was built. But the room caught it. Two of the guests near the fireplace smiled. Garrett's mother nodded once and turned back to her wine. The conversation continued at the same bright, performative volume it had been running at all evening, and no one paused or intervened because no one needed to. The thing had been said quickly and cleanly, the way small demolitions always happen, when the person swinging the hammer has practiced the motion. I stood in the hallway of my own home with my jacket smelling like black walnut shavings and linseed oil, 70 years old, holding a gift that had taken me 3 months to build, from a sketch my dead wife had drawn on the back of an envelope, and my daughter had just introduced me to a room full of strangers as the help. I thought about saying something. I had the words. Several of them, actually, lined up in the back of my throat, like tools laid out on a bench. Each one sharp enough. Each one ready. I did not use them. I looked down at the chair in my arms. The blanket had slipped slightly, and one corner of the lattice back was visible, the black walnut dark and smooth where I had finished it with 7 coats of hand-rubbed oil. The pattern Della had drawn, the joints I had cut by hand, each one fitted so tightly that you could not slide a piece of paper between them. 15 years between her sketch and this chair, and I had not changed a single line. No one was looking at it. I set the chair down in the hallway, against the wall beside the coat rack, in the space between the front door and the entrance to the living room where people walk past without looking down. I set it there the way you set down, something that you understand now will not be received the way it was made. Then I walked through the kitchen, out the back door, across the yard, and into the workshop. I closed the door behind me. I did not turn on the light. I stood in the dark for a moment and let the silence come in around me, the smell of oak and cherry and the faint, sharp sweetness of linseed oil, the only air in the world that had ever felt like it belonged to me completely. Behind me, through the walls and across the yard, the music thumped on. A burst of laughter went up louder than the rest, the kind that fills a house and somehow makes it feel emptier at the same time. I reached for the bench lamp and turned it on. The warm circle of light fell across the worktop, across the cherry cabinet I had been restoring for 3 days, across the tools in their places on the pegboard, across the years, above the door, in the glow of the lamp. The sign. Della's sign. Caldwell and Craft Fine Restoration. She had carved it from white oak herself, burned the letters in by hand with a wood-burning pen she had borrowed from a neighbor and never returned. She had presented it to me on a Saturday morning, wrapped in newspaper, tied with kitchen twine, and I had hung it that same afternoon and never moved it. That was 22 years ago. The edges of the letters had softened from weather and time, the way edges do when they have been exposed long enough, but the words were still clear. She had pressed hard. She had meant them to last. I sat down at the bench and put both hands flat on the surface. The tremor was there, the way it always was. A small, persistent shake in both hands that my doctor said was nothing to worry about and that I noticed every single day. But the tremor had never once made me inaccurate. There is a difference between shaking and being unsteady. And I had learned that difference long before the shaking started. Outside, another car started and pulled away. Then another. The party was ending or at least moving somewhere else, somewhere that did not include a 70-year-old man with sawdust on his jacket sitting alone in a workshop behind the house he had built with the hands his daughter was ashamed of. The workshop had its own kind of silence, not the heavy, suffocating kind that had filled the house all evening. Pressed flat under music and laughter, and the particular weight of people pretending to enjoy themselves more than they actually were. This silence was something older and more honest, shaped by 45 years of careful work, by the sound of hand planes moving across grain, by the slow ticking of wood settling into the shape it was always going to become. By the time the last car pulled away from the curb, I had been sitting at the bench for over an hour. The engagement party was over. The house beyond the workshop walls had gone dark and quiet. I did not go inside. I did not want to see what the living room looked like. I did not want to walk past the hallway where the chair I had spent 3 months building sat against the wall in the space between the coat rack and the front door, the space where people leave things they intend to deal with later. I sat at the bench and let the workshop hold me the way it always had. The cherry cabinet was in front of me, partially disassembled, the doors removed, and laid flat on a cloth. It was a 19th century piece, 1860s I estimated, cherry wood, with hand-dovetailed drawers, and a cornice that someone had repaired badly in the 1940s with machine-cut nails and yellow glue that had long since crystallized into something closer to glass than adhesive. The original builder had understood cherry. You could see it in the way the grain flowed uninterrupted from the left stile through the door panel and into the right stile, a continuous line that meant the builder had taken the time to book-match the boards so the wood would read as one piece. Someone had cared about this cabinet once, the way you care about anything that matters, not because you are being paid to, but because the work itself demands a certain standard and your hands know the difference. In the corner of the workshop, angled toward the window where the morning light would cross the pages of whatever she happened to be reading, stood a chair. White, ladder-back. The seat worn smooth in the center from years of use. Della had carried it out here herself one spring afternoon, without asking permission and without explanation. She had simply set it in that corner, and sat down and opened a book, as though the chair had always been there, and she was merely returning to it. She used to sit in it on Saturday mornings while I worked, reading mostly, though sometimes she would just watch. She told me once that there was something settling about the sounds in this room, the small, precise sounds of things being put right. I had not fully understood what she meant until she was gone, and the chair was empty, and the only sounds in the workshop were the ones I made myself. 7 years. The chair was still there. I had never moved it. I had moved around it, swept around it, lived around it the way you live, around anything that has become too significant to touch and too painful to remove. On the shelf behind the bench, between a copy of The Art and Practice of Marquetry and an old road atlas of North Carolina that Della had refused to throw away, sat a small notebook, dark brown leather cover, the corners worn soft from years of sitting in the same position, the spine lighter where it had been handled. On the front, in Della's careful handwriting, the letters slightly uneven. The way handwriting always is when someone is pressing hard enough to make sure the words survive, were 6 words. For Frank. When the wood starts splitting, she had placed it there herself sometime in the last weeks before she passed. I knew this because I had found it on the shelf one morning after the funeral, in a spot where it had not been before, and I had understood immediately that she had put it there during one of the afternoons I was at the shop, when she was alone in the house with whatever time she had left, and had chosen to spend some of it walking out here and placing this notebook where she knew I would find it. I had never moved it. I had never opened it. Every morning for 7 years I had come into this workshop, turned on the bench lamp, and at some point my eyes would drift to that shelf the way eyes drift to things that carry weight, and I would see the notebook, and I would read those 6 words, and then I would look away and begin my work. Not tonight. Tonight I sat at the bench with the cherry cabinet open in front of me, and the lamp casting its warm circle across the wood. And I looked at Della's notebook for a long time. The laughter from the house had stopped. The cars were gone. The music was gone. What remained was the quiet of a Friday night in October in Asheville. The faint sound of wind moving through the white oak out front. I thought about the word Sophie had used. Caretaker. As though I were a function rather than a person. As though 70 years of living and 45 years of working with my hands had been reduced to a job description that someone gives to the man they hire to rake the leaves. I thought about the chair in the hallway. 3 months of work. 15 years between Della's sketch and the finished piece. I had sanded the seat by hand until it was smooth enough that you could run your palm across it and feel nothing but warmth. No one had looked at it. It was sitting in the dark right now, in the space where people leave umbrellas and shoes and things they do not intend to think about again. I looked at the notebook on the shelf. For Frank. When the wood starts splitting, I had spent 7 years telling myself the wood had not started splitting yet, that the cracks I could feel forming were cosmetic, Surface level. The kind of damage you could fill with putty and sand, smooth and finish over. That patience was the same thing as repair. Sitting there that night, with my daughter's words still turning in the air, like something that had been released and could not be called back, I was not sure I believed that anymore. I reached my hand toward the shelf. My fingers stopped an inch from the leather cover. The familiar tremor, the small, persistent shake that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the body's quiet insistence on reminding you that time is not standing still. Then I pulled my hand back. Not tonight. But for the first time in 7 years, I had not looked away. I turned off the bench lamp. The workshop went dark except for the faint glow of October moonlight through the window, falling in a pale rectangle across Della's empty chair. I sat in that darkness for a long time, listening to the house settle, listening to the particular silence of a man who is beginning to understand that the thing he has been avoiding is no longer something he can put off by calling it patience. I heard the knock at the workshop door at 6:17, which meant Eugene Porter was running 2 minutes behind his usual Saturday time. My neighbor of 22 years came in without waiting for an answer. He had never waited for an answer. Not once in all the years I had known him. And at this point the knock itself was less a request for permission than a simple announcement that he was about to be in the room. He set a ceramic mug on the corner of the workbench where the surface was clear, the same corner he had been using since the first Saturday morning he started coming by, back when Della was still alive and the 2 mugs were 3. He set the second mug down for himself and pulled a stool from beside the door. Eugene was 73. A retired iron worker from Milwaukee who had moved to Asheville 22 years ago for reasons he had never fully explained and that I had never asked about, because Eugene was the kind of man whose privacy you respected not out of indifference, but out of the understanding that he would tell you what he wanted you to know when he was ready, and not a moment before. He had spent 40 years shaping hot metal with hammers and tongs, bending steel into railings and gates and the kind of structural work that holds buildings together from the inside where no one ever sees it. His hands were larger than mine, rougher, scarred in places where the iron had left its mark, and he moved them with the same deliberate economy that I moved mine. We had recognized that in each other early on. The language of men whose hands have been their primary vocabulary for longer than most conversations last. He settled onto the stool and wrapped both hands around his mug. The coffee was from the place on Haywood Street, the Guatemalan blend he preferred, and that he brought every Saturday without ever asking whether I wanted it, because he had decided a long time ago that I did. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. That was the other thing about Eugene. He understood that silence between 2 people who know each other well is not the same thing as emptiness. It is a room with the furniture already in place. You do not need to fill it with anything. You just sit in it. He was looking at the cherry cabinet on the bench. The doors laid flat. The crystallized glue exposed where I had begun to remove it. He looked at it the way he looked at most things in this workshop, with the quiet attention of a man who understands the relationship between damage and repair, even when the material is not his own. "That's a nice piece," he said. 1860s, I said. "Cherry. Someone tried to fix the cornice with yellow glue and machine nails about 80 years ago. Made it worse." Eugene nodded. "Usually does." I told him about the night before. Not all at once. It came out in pieces. The way things do when you are still sorting through them yourself, when the sequence of events is clear, but the meaning of them has not yet settled into any shape you can hold up to the light and read. The cars in front of the house, the strangers in the living room, Della's things moved or missing, Sophie's voice in the hallway, bright and practiced, the word caretaker, landing in the room the way a hammer lands, on a piece of metal that was not expecting the blow. The chair no one looked at. Eugene listened without interrupting. He did not nod along. He did not make the small, encouraging sounds that people make when they are listening, for the purpose of demonstrating that they are listening. He simply sat there with his coffee and his attention and let me find my way through it at whatever pace the telling required. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment. He looked at the cherry cabinet on the bench, then at the tools on the pegboard. then at Della's white chair in the corner. His eyes rested there for a second longer than the other places, and I knew he was thinking about the same thing I was. Della would have had her out the front door by the end of the first month, he said. I know, I said. He picked up his mug, took a long, slow drink, set it back down carefully, away from my tools, the way he always did, because he understood that a man's bench is not a counter, and the things on it are not casual. How many more coats of varnish you gonna put on this thing, Frank? He said, and he was not looking at the cabinet when he said it. He was looking at me. Before you admit the wood underneath is rotten, the question sat in the workshop, the way his questions always did, heavy and direct and shaped with the precision of a man who had spent his life working with materials that do not respond to indirectness. Iron does not care about your feelings. You heat it, you strike it, you shape it, or you do not. Eugene had carried that principle into every conversation I had ever had with him, and I had never once resented him for it, because he was never cruel about it. He was just accurate. I did not answer. I looked at the cherry cabinet in front of me, at the joints I had been cleaning for 3 days, each one carefully exposed, each one telling me exactly what had been done to it and what it needed now. And I thought about the fact that I could read damage in a piece of wood from 200 years ago with perfect clarity, but I had spent the last several years unable to read the damage in my own house with anything close to the same honesty. Eugene left around 7:15, the way he always did on Saturday mornings. I watched him cross the backyard through the workshop window, his canvas coat dark against the pale morning fog, and disappear through the gate in the fence. I picked up my tools and went back to the cabinet, and then from somewhere beyond the back door of the house, I heard my daughter's voice. She was on the front porch, talking on her phone. I could not make out the words from where I sat, just the tone of it. Easy, unhurried, confident. The voice of someone who is not being watched. Not the voice she had used with me. A different instrument. Entirely. I set my tools down on the bench. I sat very still and listened to the shape of that conversation. The rhythm, the pauses, the way her voice dropped at certain moments and rose at others. I could not hear what she was saying, but I had spent 45 years learning how to read the behavior of wood under stress, and something in the grain of that voice told me the cabinet on my bench was not the only thing in this house that had been damaged from the inside. By someone who did not understand what they were doing. I needed a narrower chisel. That was the only reason I got up from the bench that morning. The number 3 gouge I had been using on the cherry cabinet's cornice was leaving marks wider than I wanted on the fluting, and the set I kept inside the house, in the hallway closet where Della had organized my overflow tools years ago into labeled drawers that I had never rearranged, was more complete than the one out here. A small thing. An ordinary errand. The kind of thing that happens without consequence 100 times a week. I covered the cabinet with a clean cloth the way you do when you leave a piece mid-restoration and pushed back from the bench. The fog had thinned enough that I could see the back of the house clearly now, the covered porch, the kitchen windows, the second-floor gable with its original shingle siding that I had replaced board by board in 2008. Every piece of that house I could name. Every board I could tell you where the wood had come from, what year I had cut it, whether it had gone in easy or fought me. The back door was pulled almost shut but not latched, the way it often was when someone had gone through it in a hurry without thinking about the door behind them. I stepped into the hallway. The back hallway runs from the kitchen toward the rear entrance, past the utility room and the coat closet, ending at the door that connects to the front of the house. From here, with the back door open and the front porch just beyond the living room, sound carries in a direct line. There is no insulation in that stretch of wall. I had always meant to add some. I never had. I could hear Sophie's voice from the moment I entered the hallway. She was on the front porch. She was not speaking quietly. She had no reason to. She did not know the back door was unlatched. Did not know I had come inside. Did not know anything, except that she was standing on the porch of a house she had apparently already decided was hers. Her voice had that particular ease to it. The loose, unhurried confidence of a person who is not being observed. I had heard it the night before through the workshop walls without being able to make out the words. Now I could make out the words. I stopped walking. I was not trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I stopped because my feet stopped the way they sometimes do, before the rest of you has caught up to what your ears have already understood. Once we're married, Garrett's handling the property side. Sophie was saying. Her tone was conversational, practical. The tone of someone discussing logistics rather than making plans that involved another person's life without their knowledge. The upstairs can be reconfigured easily. 2 units up there, maybe 3 if you open the wall between the back bedrooms. The main floor stays as a primary unit. Dad can keep his little workshop for now. But the house itself, the Montford location alone, we're talking serious value. 3 rental units, maybe 4 if the zoning works. A pause. Someone on the other end said something. Sophie laughed. The short, efficient laugh of a person confirming something they already knew. No, he doesn't know. He doesn't need to know yet. It's just a matter of timing. I stood in the back hallway of my house for what felt like a very long time. The utility room was to my left. The coat closet was to my right. A strip of pale October sunlight lay across the heart pine floor where the back door had let it in. I looked at that strip of light on the wood. On the floor I had salvaged from a church in Black Mountain and laid with my own hands. And I thought about the words she had used. For now, his little workshop. A matter of timing, as though I were a variable in a schedule. As though 70 years of living and 30 years of building this house had been reduced to an inconvenient gap between where she was and where she intended to be. The same word I had built my whole understanding of patience around. Timing. Turned inside out and made into something that was being used against me. I thought about the floors beneath my feet. I had laid every board in this hallway myself. Heart pine, reclaimed. Each one hand-selected for straightness and grain. I had spent 3 weekends fitting them because heart pine is dense and unforgiving and does not tolerate imprecision. If you rush it, if you force a board into a space it was not cut for, the whole floor will shift over time, and nothing will sit level again. I had not rushed it. I had measured twice and cut once, and laid every board with the grain running east to west, and in 20 years not a single one had shifted. And now my daughter was standing on the porch of this house making phone calls about converting it into rental units while I was still living in it. I turned around and walked back to the workshop without the chisel. I sat down at the bench and put both hands flat on the worktop. The tremor was there. I looked at my hands. The sawdust in the creases. The calluses along the right palm from decades of holding fine tools. The thin scar on my left thumb from the draw knife in 1983. The faint permanent stain of linseed oil in the grain of my skin that no amount of washing had ever fully removed, and that my daughter had described to a room full of strangers as a smell that followed me. 45 years of work in a pair of hands that my daughter found embarrassing enough to hide from her fiancé's family. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the workbench. Inside, beneath a stack of old receipts and a folder of warranty documents for tools I no longer owned, was a manila envelope. I had not looked at it in over a year. I pulled it out and set it on the bench. Inside was the deed to the house on Montford Avenue. I spread it open on the worktop and read the name printed across the top line. Franklin James Caldwell. One name. Only one. I had arranged it that way years ago, after Della mentioned a neighbor whose family had lost a house in a probate dispute because the deed carried 2 names and the wrong one outlived the right one. I had gone to the title office the following week. Just mine. A quiet decision made without announcement. The way most of the important ones are. I sat there and let that fact settle. One name on the deed. The house I built. The floors I laid. The walls I framed. The roof I shingled in the August heat of 1993 while Della sat in the yard below reading aloud from a novel because she said the sound of her voice would keep me from falling. My house. Still mine. I folded the deed and put it back in the drawer. I closed the drawer and sat with the deed's weight still in my hands, even though the paper was no longer there. One name. My name. The house I had built board by board from a bare foundation in 1991 to the last piece of crown molding in 1994. Still mine on paper. Still mine. In law. Still mine in every way that a piece of property can belong to a person who has poured 45 years of his life into its walls. And yet my daughter was standing on its porch, making plans to divide it into rental units, as though the man who built it were already gone. I sat there and let that fact settle the way glue settles into a joint, slowly, finding every gap, filling every space, and then hardening into something that cannot be undone without breaking the wood around it. And while I sat there, without quite deciding to, I found myself remembering something from 2 weeks earlier. Garrett had come by on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to have lunch. Though he had eaten half a sandwich and spent most of the visit standing in my study, the room at the front of the house where I kept the display case. The case was built into the wall between the two front windows, glass-fronted, felt-lined, temperature-stable. I had built it myself 12 years ago, specifically to hold the restored pieces, the ones I had spent years acquiring and restoring to museum condition. A Chippendale side table from 1782, Philadelphia school, mahogany with ball and claw feet, and a tilt top that still operated on its original birdcage mechanism. A Federal-style secretary desk, circa 1815, cherry and poplar. The writing surface inlaid with satinwood, in a pattern I had spent 4 months reconstructing from a photograph of the original. A set of 6 Windsor chairs, bowback, New England origin, circa 1800, with the continuous arm that only the best period makers could achieve, without a visible joint. Together, conservatively appraised, the collection was worth over $200,000. I knew this because I had it appraised every 3 years for insurance purposes, and the last valuation had come in at $217,000. Garrett had stood in front of that case for 20 minutes. He had asked questions, not the questions of a man admiring craftsmanship, the questions of a man taking inventory. Year of manufacture, style classification, what would a comparable piece sell for at auction? Whether I had provenance documentation, whether the insurance was current. The questions of a man who has already decided what he intends to do with something and is simply confirming the numbers. I had answered them. I had answered every one of them with the patient directness I use with all customers and strangers. And I had watched his face while he listened, and I had seen something there that I recognized from 45 years of reading wood. The expression of a person looking at material and seeing only what it can be converted into. Not what it is. Not what it took to make it. Not the years of skill and patience and knowledge that live inside every joint and surface. Just the number at the end. Della had a word for that. She used to say that some people look at a tree and see lumber. Others look at a tree and see a tree. The difference, she said, is not intelligence. It is character. 3 days after Garrett's visit, on a Tuesday morning before I opened the shop, I had driven to a climate-controlled storage facility in Biltmore Village. It was a small place, professionally managed, the kind of facility that antique dealers and estate managers use when they need preservation-grade conditions for valuable pieces. I had rented a unit. I had loaded the Chippendale table, the Federal secretary, and the Windsor chairs into my truck, wrapped in moving blankets and secured with ratchet straps the way I transport every piece. And I had driven them to the unit and locked the door. Then I had gone home and placed replicas in the case, not cheap copies. Proper reproductions that I had built myself over the years for study and reference, the way a serious restorer does. Each one constructed to period specifications, each one using appropriate materials and techniques, each one close enough to the original that a casual observer would not notice the difference. But a trained eye would. A trained hand would know in an instant the way I would know. Because the weight is different. Because the wear patterns are wrong. Because a reproduction carries the confidence of its maker, but not the history of its age. Della had tolerated this habit with the gentle skepticism she applied to most of my workshop logic. "Why keep something fake when you have the real thing?" she had asked once. "Because you learn the same mechanics without risking the original," I had told her. She had accepted this the way she accepted most of my answers. Not entirely convinced, but willing to let it stand. The real ones were in Biltmore Village now. 3 weeks. And no one in this house had looked at the case closely enough to notice. No one had touched the glass. No one had opened the doors. The pieces sat there behind their felt-lined shelves, and the people who had plans for them walked past every day without understanding that the things they were counting on had already been moved beyond their reach. I was a woodworker. I knew how to protect the pieces worth protecting. I sat at the bench and thought about that. Then I reached for my phone. There was a number I had saved 2 years ago and never used. A woman named Catherine Mercer, who had handed me her card at a Montford Neighborhood Association meeting on a Tuesday evening in October. One of those neighborhood gatherings where everyone sits in folding chairs in the community room and talks about street trees and property assessments, and whether the new development on Haywood was going to affect parking. She had passed her card to me during the coffee break without me asking for it. "In case you ever need anything," she had said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has built a career on being available at the right moment. Catherine Mercer. Mercer Historic Properties. Licensed real estate broker. State of North Carolina. I had put the number in my phone that evening and had not looked at it since. I looked at it now. The screen glowed in the workshop light, the name and number small and clear. I held the phone for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was nothing, and the weight of what it represented, which was everything. I put the phone down on the bench without calling. Not yet. But the decision had already been made, and made decisions have a different weight than undecided ones. I could feel it settling the way a joint settles when the glue finds its hold, and the two pieces that were separate a moment ago become, quietly and permanently, one thing. I called her Saturday night at 9:23, after the last of the workshop clocks had settled into their evening rhythm and the house beyond the back door had gone dark. She answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who is never entirely off duty. "This is Catherine. My name is Franklin Caldwell," I said. "I have a home on Montford Avenue. 4 bedrooms, 2 stories, Queen Anne. Paid off completely. No liens, no disputes. I kept my voice the way I keep my hands when I am working on something that requires accuracy. Level. Unhurried. If someone wanted to sell fairly quickly, how fast could that realistically happen in this market? A brief silence. Not hesitation. The silence of someone thinking precisely before they speak. Mr. Caldwell. A well-maintained historic property in Montford, with clean title, and a motivated seller." She let the sentence breathe. "In this market, you could have a serious offer within a week, sometimes faster if the pricing is right. What would you need from me?" "Just a walkthrough," she said. "And an honest conversation." "Monday morning," I said. "Early. 6:30 if that works." A small pause. The mild surprise of someone unaccustomed to being asked for a pre-dawn appointment on a weekend call. "I can do that," she said. "I'll see you Monday, Mr. Caldwell." She arrived at 6:29. I know this because I was standing at the kitchen window with my first cup of coffee, watching the street, and I saw the dark gray Volvo pull to the curb with the quiet precision of someone who considers punctuality a professional instrument. She came up the front walk with a leather portfolio under one arm and a coffee of her own in the other hand, wearing a charcoal blazer over dark trousers, her silver hair pulled back without fuss. She was the kind of woman who had walked through 1,000 houses in her career and had learned how to enter each one without imposing herself on it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and shook my hand at the door. Firm grip. Brief. Professional. In the way that people are professional when they do not need to perform it. "Come in," I said. "Coffee's on the counter." She set her portfolio on the kitchen table and took a slow look around. Not the hurried assessment of someone working through a checklist, but the careful, unhurried attention of someone who understands that a house will tell you what it needs to tell you if you give it a moment. She looked at the ceiling height, the quality of the early morning light coming through the east-facing windows, the heart pine floors, and the way they caught the light. The built-in bookshelves in the living room, the chestnut ones I had made from reclaimed wood because Della said factory shelves had no soul. I drank my coffee and let her look. We moved through the house room by room. She asked practical questions. The age of the roof, whether the original plaster was intact or had been replaced. The condition of the foundation. I answered each one directly, and she made notes in her portfolio without commenting on what she saw, which I appreciated. Most people feel the need to fill silence with observations. Catherine seemed to understand that silence in a house is information. The upstairs hallway. The guest bedroom with its view of the white oak. The master bedroom, where I had slept on my side of the bed for 7 years, without ever moving to the center. She noted the closet space and said nothing else. Then we went out through the side door to the workshop. She stepped inside and stopped. I watched her eyes move across the room. The pegboard of tools arranged by size and function, each one in its place, each outline traced in pencil on the board behind it, so that any absence was immediately visible. The cherry cabinet on the bench, half restored, its doors laid open. The clocks on the far wall, 3 of them, all running, all keeping time in their overlapping way. The bracket clock in the corner that had been here longer than Sophie had been alive. And above the door, the sign. Della's sign. The white oak letters burned in by hand, the edges softened by 22 years of weather and use but still perfectly legible. Caldwell and Craft Fine Restoration. This is remarkable, Catherine said. She was not performing the compliment. I could hear the difference. My wife designed it, I said. The layout, the lighting, the workflow. All of it. She spent a whole weekend sketching it on graph paper before I cut a single board. Catherine looked at Della's white chair in the corner. Just a glance, not prolonged. The glance of someone who has learned to recognize the weight of an object that has not been moved in a long time. Then she looked back at the room. She had good instincts, she said. Yes, I said. She did. We went back inside to the kitchen. Catherine set her portfolio on the table, opened it, and looked at me directly. The morning light was coming in strong now through the east windows, falling across the table between us in a wide band that made the oak surface glow. Is there anyone else living in the home, Mr. Caldwell? My daughter, I said. And her fiancé. They've been staying here. Do they know about this? Not yet. She nodded once. The nod of a woman who had heard variations of this answer before and had learned not to attach judgment to it. All right, she said. Then let me ask you something more important. She set her pen down on the portfolio. What do you want most from this sale? I looked past her at the kitchen window. Outside, the October fog was beginning to thin at the edges. The white oak was coming into focus, leaf by leaf, copper and bronze in the early light. The workshop was a shape beyond it. And just above the door, if the angle was right, you could see the top edge of Della's sign. Clean, I said. No complications, no delays, no drawn-out negotiation that gives anyone time to find a reason to slow things down. Then we price it right from the start, she said. No games, no anchoring high and hoping. We come in at market, generate real interest, and move. That's what I want. She picked up her pen and made a note. That was when we heard the footsteps on the stairs. Sophie came into the kitchen first. She had her hair down, still wearing the oversized shirt she slept in. And she stopped in the doorway when she saw Catherine. The portfolio on the table, the pen, the way two people look when they are in the middle of a transaction that has already begun. The color left her face in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Garrett appeared behind her 5 seconds later. Unshaven, hair angled from sleep. He took in the scene with the slow, flat look of someone whose mind is catching up to what his eyes have already registered. He heard the word realtor. I do not know whether Catherine said it or whether Sophie did, But he stopped at the bottom step like something solid had been placed in front of him that had not been there when he went to sleep. "What is she doing here?" Garrett's voice came out rough at the edges, aimed at me, not at Catherine. He was standing on the bottom step with one hand on the banister, still in the clothes he had slept in. His hair pressed flat on one side, and his face carried the expression of a man who has walked into a room where the furniture has been rearranged without his permission. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, set the pot back on the burner, turned around. "She's here to help me sell the house," I said. The sentence landed in the kitchen the way a chisel lands when you set it down on a bench with intention. Not thrown, not dropped, placed. "You can't sell this house." The words came out fast, louder than he intended. And I watched him register that volume and attempt to pull it back. He glanced at Catherine, who had closed her portfolio and was standing beside the table with the composed stillness of a woman who has witnessed this exact scene in other kitchens and has learned that the most professional thing she can do is remain precisely where she is. "Dad!" Sophie's voice came from behind Garrett, still in the doorway. Quieter than his, but with a different kind of weight. "Dad, you cannot sell this house." I set my cup down on the counter slowly, the way you set a finished piece down when you have nothing left to prove about how steady your hands are. I looked at my daughter, then at Garrett, then back at my daughter. "Watch me," I said. 2 words. I had spent 45 years learning that the most important part of any joint is the part you cannot see, the glue between the surfaces, the tension that holds 2 pieces together without any visible fastener. And I had spent the last 3 days learning that some joints are not worth saving. Garrett opened his mouth. I watched the beginning of something form there. An argument. A negotiation. The particular kind of reasoning that a man like Garrett reaches for when he senses that the ground beneath a transaction is shifting. Whatever it was, he stopped it before it became words. He looked at Catherine once more, then turned and went back up the stairs. His footsteps were heavier going up than they had been coming down. Sophie stayed in the doorway for a moment longer. But I watched her eyes move around the kitchen, across the countertops, the window, the hallway, the built-in shelves, in a way that had nothing to do with surprise or anger. It was the same way Garrett had looked at the display case 2 weeks ago. Methodical, quiet. The eyes of someone taking inventory of a place they have already decided belongs to them. She did not know I was watching her do it. She never did. Then she turned and followed Garrett up the stairs. Her door closed at the end of the hallway, with the soft, controlled click of a latch finding its seat. Catherine picked up her portfolio. She looked at me with the steady attention of a professional who has just witnessed something she expected and is calibrating her next sentence accordingly. "I'll have the comparative analysis to you by this afternoon," she said. "We can discuss pricing tonight if you're ready." "I'm ready," I said. She shook my hand at the front door. Firm grip. Brief. The same handshake as the first one. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard to her Volvo without looking back at the house. And I appreciated that, the professionalism of someone who understands that looking back at a house you are about to sell is the client's job, not the broker's. I went to the shop at 10. A woman from Weaverville had brought in a walnut blanket chest with a broken lid hinge, straightforward work, the kind that steadies the hands and quiets the mind. I finished it by 2, delivered it by 4, drove home through the residential streets of Montford with the windows cracked, breathing in the smell of fallen leaves and someone's wood fire 2 blocks over on Cumberland Avenue. The house was quiet when I came in. Whatever had happened at breakfast. Garrett's voice going rough, Sophie standing silent in the doorway, had apparently settled back into the uneasy stillness that passed for normal around here. I could hear Garrett's voice upstairs, low and indistinct. Another phone call. Sophie's door was closed. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over a house in the late afternoon that has nothing to do with whether anyone is home. It is the quiet of a day winding down, of light changing, of the ordinary machinery of a household running at half speed. I had always liked this hour. Della had called it the amber hour. Not for the light, though the light was part of it. but for the way time seemed to move through it more slowly, like something suspended in resin, preserved, held still long enough to look at properly. The amber hour. I had not thought of that phrase in months, but standing at the counter with the kettle beginning to hiss on the burner behind me, the late afternoon light falling in a long gold stripe across the oak table, I could hear her saying it. The way she said everything that mattered, quietly, without emphasis, as though the truth of a thing did not require volume to make itself understood. The kettle had not yet reached a boil when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. A number I did not recognize. Area code 828. Local. Asheville. Or the surrounding county. I answered it the way I answer all calls from numbers I do not know, with a kind of neutral readiness, prepared for it to be nothing important. It was not nothing important. Mr. Caldwell? The voice on the other end was measured, careful. A man in his early 40s, I would have guessed. The voice of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now trying to deliver it without letting the rehearsal show. My name is Paul Weston. I'm a small business investor based in Hendersonville. A brief pause. I invested in a company called Caldwell Heritage Properties approximately 14 months ago. A $55,000 commitment, dispersed in 2 installments. Another pause. Shorter. I was given to understand that you were a co-signatory on the underlying loan guarantee. I've been trying to reach you for several months. I set the kettle down on the counter without turning off the burner. I'm sorry, I said. A co-signatory on what, exactly? The silence on his end lasted long enough that I could hear him deciding something. Deciding how much to say. Deciding whether the man on the other end of this call was the man he had been told about or someone else entirely. Mr. Caldwell, Paul Weston said carefully, there are documents on file with our investment group that carry your signature. Your full name. Franklin J. Caldwell. They were presented to us by your daughter's fiancé as evidence of family backing for the venture. The documents were part of the original loan guarantee package submitted to 4 independent investors. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. Above me, through the ceiling, I could hear Garrett's voice. Easy. Unhurried. The particular rhythm of a man who believes he is ahead of everything. The kettle began to steam quietly on the burner behind me. Mr. Weston, I said, I need you to send me those documents. Everything you have. Right now, if possible. I can do that. There was something in his voice that I recognized. Not hostility. The exhausted relief of a man who has been trying to get to this moment for a long time and has finally arrived at a door that might actually open. I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not calling to make threats. I'm calling because I think we may both have a problem, and I'd rather deal with it honestly. He paused once more. I don't believe you knew about this. Send the documents, I said. Please. He did. I watched the email arrive in real time, the small notification at the top of my phone screen, the sender name P. Weston, the subject line reading Caldwell Heritage Properties Guarantee Documentation. I opened it at the kitchen table with the amber light still falling across the oak surface and the kettle still steaming on the burner and the sound of Garrett's voice still moving through the ceiling above me like something that belonged to a different house than the one I was sitting in. There were 4 attachments. I opened the largest one first. A 14-page investment agreement. Single-spaced. The kind of document that takes a lawyer an hour to read properly, and a layman 3. I scrolled past the cover page, past the terms, past the disbursement schedule that showed 2 payments totaling $55,000 transferred to an operating account at a regional bank in Hendersonville, past the company registration, Caldwell Heritage Properties, LLC, registered in the state of North Carolina in August of the previous year, dissolved the following February. 6 months of existence. 6 months in which 4 people had put their money into something that carried my family name and then watched it disappear. I scrolled to the signature page at the back. Franklin J. Caldwell. Written in blue ink. Dated 13 months ago. I looked at that signature for a long time. 45 years of signing my name. On invoices. On certificates of authenticity. On appraisal documents and insurance forms and the small brass plates I attach to the back of every piece I restore. The plates that carry my name and the date and the words restored by F. Caldwell, because Della had told me once that a man who does not sign his work does not fully own it. 45 years of the same pen moving in the same way across paper, and across wood, and across brass, and across every surface that would accept ink. I knew my own signature the way I knew the grain of white oak. I had looked at it 10,000 times. I could have drawn it in the dark. This one was close. The general shape was right. The proportions were reasonable. Someone had spent real time on it, practicing the loops and the angles, getting the overall impression to a point where a casual glance would not raise a question. But a casual glance was not what I was giving it. The F was wrong. My capital F has a characteristic that comes from 45 years of signing wood with a fountain pen. When you sign your name on a piece of wood, you do not lift the pen between letters the way you do on paper, because ink on wood behaves differently. It pools if you hesitate. It bleeds if you stop, so you learn to keep the pen moving, to carry the stroke from one letter into the next without breaking contact. My F flows directly into the R that follows it. The crossbar of the F extends into a connecting stroke that becomes the upstroke of the R. It is not something I decided to do. It is something my hand learned to do over decades of practice on a surface that does not forgive hesitation. The signature on this document did not have that connecting stroke. The F stood alone. The crossbar ended where a crossbar ends on paper, cleanly, without extending. Whoever had practiced this had studied the way my signature looks. They had not understood the way it moves. It was close. It was not mine. I set the phone face down on the table. I sat still for a moment, with my hands flat on the oak surface, the way I had sat at the workbench on Saturday night. Not because I was calm, but because stillness is what I reach for when everything else wants to move too fast. A woodworker's hands do not shake more when the work gets difficult. They shake less. You slow down. You breathe. You let the tool find its line. I picked up the phone again and looked at the other attachments. The company registration, the bank statements, the investor correspondence, all of it carrying my family name on the letterhead. Caldwell Heritage Properties, LLC. As though the name I had spent 45 years building, the name Della had burned into the sign above the workshop door. The name on every piece I had ever restored had been borrowed without permission and attached to something that existed for 6 months and left 4 people holding empty receipts. Above me, through the ceiling, Garrett's voice continued, low and easy. The voice of a man talking on the phone on a Monday evening with no particular weight on his shoulders. I turned off the burner. The kettle went quiet. The kitchen went quiet. Everything went quiet except for that voice upstairs, moving through the house the way smoke moves through wood, finding every crack, filling every space, leaving its mark in places you cannot reach without taking the whole structure apart. I had spent 45 years reading the behavior of wood, the way it bends under pressure, the way it hides damage beneath a smooth surface, the way it tells you exactly what it is if you know how to look. Something in the grain of this situation told me the cabinet on my workbench was not the only thing in this house that had been damaged from the inside by someone who did not understand the material they were working with. I picked up the phone and called Thomas Redfield. Thomas had been Della's attorney for 15 years. Starting with the estate planning we had done together in 2009 and continuing through the will, the trust, the medical directives, and the final arrangements that no one wants to make but that Della had insisted on completing while she was still well enough to make her own decisions. He was a quiet, methodical man who wore the same style of wire-framed glasses he had worn the first day I met him, and who had never once in all those years given me advice I regretted taking. He answered on the second ring. Thomas always answered on the second ring. I had never understood whether this was habit or policy, but it had the effect of making you feel that your call was expected, even when it was not. I told him everything, The call from Paul Weston. The documents. The company registered under my family name. The signature on page 12 that looked like mine, but moved like someone else's. When I finished, Thomas was quiet for 3 full seconds. I counted them. "Frank," he said. And the way he said my name told me he had already begun thinking through the implications, the way a man like Thomas thinks, which is to say structurally, from the foundation up. "I need you to forward me everything Weston sent. Tonight, if possible. I'll have my paralegal run the company registration first thing in the morning, but I want to see the signature page myself before I say anything definitive." I forwarded the email while he was still on the line. I heard the notification on his end. A small chime, and then silence as he opened the attachment. "The F," he said after a moment. "Not a question. An observation." "Yes," I said. "Your F connects. I've seen your signature on 24 documents in my office. The crossbar carries into the next letter. This one stops." "I know." Another pause. I could hear him scrolling. "The C in Caldwell," he said. "Yours opens wider at the base. It's a generous letter, the way you write it. This one closes tight. Pinched." He stopped. "Frank, whoever practiced this spent real time on it. They got close. But they were copying the shape of the signature, not the motion. They didn't understand that your hand has habits that come from your trade, not from penmanship." He was right. That was exactly it. The signature on that document had been made by someone who had looked at my name on paper many times, but had never watched me sign it on wood, had never understood that the way a man moves a pen across a surface is determined not just by the letters he is forming, but by every other surface his hand has ever learned to write on. "If this is what I think it is," Thomas said, "we need to move before the property sale closes. Signature forgery in North Carolina carries serious consequences. And Frank," he paused, "if Garrett did this once, there may be other documents we haven't seen yet." I sat in the kitchen with the phone against my ear and the overhead light off and only the stove lamp casting its warm circle across the counter. Della's lamp, the one she always kept on, because she said the overhead made the kitchen feel like a waiting room. I let Thomas's sentence settle into me the way a diagnosis settles, not all at once, but layer by layer, each layer revealing something new about the shape of the thing you are dealing with. "What do I need to do?" I said. "I'm filing an affidavit on your behalf with the county recorder's office. A formal declaration that the signature is not yours and that you had no knowledge of the loan guarantee. This needs to be on record before the property sale closes. A title search during escrow could surface the investor claims if any of them have filed liens." He stopped. "I would advise against confronting anyone in the house directly before the affidavit is filed. If Garrett moves assets or disputes the record first, it complicates things. Do what you need to do," I said. "I'll have it drafted by Thursday morning." After I hung up, I sat in the dark kitchen for a while with just the stove lamp and the sound of the house settling around me. I thought about the first time Sophie had asked me for money. She had been 22, fresh out of UNC Asheville. A deposit on an apartment in Charlotte where she had landed her first job at a design firm. I had given her $1,200 and never mentioned it again, because that was what you did. You gave. And you did not keep accounts. That was the contract of being a father, or at least the version of it I had believed in for 35 years. I opened the side drawer of the kitchen desk, the small oak desk Della had placed there the year we moved in because she said a kitchen without a place to sit and write was just a room where people ate. I took out a sheet of paper and a pen. I began to write. Dates on the left. Amounts on the right. A brief description, in the narrow space between. September 2012. Charlotte apartment deposit. $1,200. March 2014. Car insurance lapsed. Paid directly to prevent cancellation. $840. November 2015. Credit card balance transferred without disclosure. $2,200. And so it continued line by line, year by year. The small, quiet payments that a father makes when he has decided that keeping the peace is worth more than keeping the record. Some of the amounts were small enough that each one had felt manageable at the time. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. The pattern was not manageable. It was 12 years long, and it totaled $31,000 before the final entry. I picked up the pen again. At the bottom of the list, below the last line, I added 2 new entries separated from the rest by a single blank space. October 2025. Caldwell Heritage Properties LLC. Loan guarantee. Forged signature. $55,000. C. Attached documentation. I set the pen down. I read the list from the beginning. Then I folded the sheet, placed it inside a white envelope along with printed copies of the documents Paul Weston had sent, and set it on the desk. I pressed the flap down but did not seal it. A sealed envelope is a statement. This was not a statement yet. It was a record. And records are kept open until the moment they are needed. The kind of record that a careful man keeps, so that when the moment comes, the grain speaks for itself, and no one can argue with the rings. After 3 days of rain, Thursday came in clear. The kind of October morning that Asheville gives you maybe a dozen times a season, where the sky arrives pale blue from the first hour, and the light falls through the trees at an angle that makes the whole neighborhood look like someone arranged it on purpose. The white oak in the front yard had gone deeper red overnight, the way hardwoods do after a long wet stretch, as though the rain had unlocked something in the leaves that the dry weather had been holding back. The photographer arrived at 8 exactly. His name was Kyle. Mid-20s. Methodical in the way that young professionals are when they are still earning the right to be confident. He drove a white hatchback and carried his equipment in 2 hard cases, which he set on the porch and opened with the focused efficiency of someone who does the same setup in a different house every morning. Wide-angle lens. Portable light panel. A carbon fiber tripod that he assembled without looking at his hands. "I'll start with the main rooms and work back," he said. "Natural light first, then I'll supplement. Usually takes about 2 hours. Take whatever time you need," I said, and stepped out of his way. That was the thing about having a professional come into your home to document it. You had to learn to stop being the one in charge of the space. To stand back and watch a stranger see your house the way a stranger sees it. The proportions of the front room, the way the morning light moved across the heart pine floors. The built-in chestnut bookshelves catching the sun in a way that turned the grain almost golden. Kyle did not say much. He moved and shot, each shutter click landing in the quiet of the house like something being recorded that could not be taken back. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs at 8:45. She stood there with her arms crossed, watching Kyle move through the living room below. She was dressed, her hair pulled back, and her expression was the expression of a person who has decided something is not real and is waiting for reality to agree with her. She did not say anything to me. She followed Kyle up the stairs at a distance that was designed to look casual but was not casual at all, drifting room to room slightly behind him, pausing in doorways, taking in the angles he was shooting. When they reached the study, the room at the front of the house where the display case stood between the 2 windows, she stopped. I was in the hallway outside the room. She did not know I was there. I watched her stand in front of the glass case for a moment. Her eyes moved across the felt-lined shelves, across the replica Chippendale table, the Federal Secretary, the Windsor chairs. She reached out once, just her fingertips resting briefly against the glass, and then she withdrew her hand, the way a person withdraws from something that is not yet ready to be touched, but that they have already decided they will return to. Then she followed Kyle to the next room without a word. Garrett had left the house at 7:30. I had heard the front door close and his car start and pull away, and he had not come back. I did not know where he went. I did not need to. Kyle saved the workshop for last. He stood in the doorway before he came inside, the same pause that the room seemed to require from anyone seeing it for the first time. The pegboard, the cherry cabinet on the bench, the clocks on the wall, still running, the bracket clock in the corner. And above the door, Della's sign, the white oak letters softened by weather, but still perfectly clear. "This is the most interesting room in the house," Kyle said. He was already adjusting his lens. "It was my wife's favorite too," I said. He nodded without looking up from his viewfinder, and I appreciated that he did not ask about her. Catherine had scheduled the first showing for 10:30. By noon, 3 groups had come through. A young couple from West Asheville who moved through the rooms quickly and talked about square footage. An older pair who spent most of their time in the garden looking at the fence line. And a single man. Alone. Somewhere in his early 40s. He was the one I noticed. He wore a gray fleece jacket over dark jeans, and he moved through the house with more attention than the space usually receives from buyers. He was not hurried. He did not ask many questions. He moved the way people move when they are confirming details they have already studied, rather than encountering them for the first time. Catherine guided him through the main rooms, and I stayed back, watching from the dining room archway the way Catherine had told me to. "Stay visible but not present. Walter. Let the house speak." He said almost nothing until he reached the workshop. He stopped at the door. Not the pause of someone processing an unfamiliar room. Something else. His eyes went directly to the sign above the doorframe. Caldwell and Craft Fine Restoration. He stood there and read it. Then he read it again, and his gaze dropped to the bench, to the tools on the pegboard, to the cherry cabinet half restored, to the clocks on the wall, moving across the room with a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with real estate. I was standing 10 feet behind him. I watched him stand there. Whatever he was seeing, it was not the square footage. He came back to himself after a moment, straightened slightly, and followed Catherine toward the back garden without saying anything. I stayed where I was, looking at the space where he had been standing, at the doorway, at the sign above it that Della had carved 22 years ago on a Saturday morning with a borrowed wood-burning pen, and the particular determination of a woman who believed that putting your name on something properly was the only way to put it on at all. That evening, Catherine's message came through while I was at the bench. "Photos are excellent, Frank. Listing goes live at 7 tomorrow morning. 2 showing requests already. One specifically asked about the woodworking shop. I read it twice. Set the phone down. Picked it up and read it again. Someone had asked specifically about the workshop. I did not know why that stopped me the way it did. Just a small hesitation, like a joint catching for half a second before it finds its seat. The feeling that something was moving toward this house that I had not planned for and could not quite see yet. The last of the showing visitors left by 1:30. Kyle had packed his equipment and gone by 10:15. The house settled back into the particular quiet that follows strangers. That sense of the walls reasserting themselves, reclaiming their own air. I had eaten lunch alone in the kitchen, listening to the television upstairs where Sophie had parked herself after the showings ended. A daytime talk show drifted through the ceiling at irregular intervals, punctuating the silence the way a clock with a faulty escapement ticks, present but unsteady, reminding you that something is slightly off with the mechanism. I was in the hallway outside the study at 2:15 when I heard the glass doors open. The sound was small. 2 panels of glass moving against felt-lined tracks. A whisper of friction that most people would not have noticed. I noticed it because I had built that case myself, and I knew exactly how it sounded when someone opened it. The particular pitch of glass against wood, the slight resistance at the halfway point where the left panel catches before it slides free. I stopped walking. I was 3 steps from the study doorway. Through the gap between the door and the frame, I could see Sophie inside the room. She had both panels of the display case open, the way you open it when you intend to reach inside rather than simply look. Her back was to me. I watched her hands move across the felt-covered shelf, bypassing the Windsor chair reproductions on the left, going directly to the piece on the far right, the Chippendale side table, the mahogany miniature with the ball and claw feet, and the tilt-top mechanism, the one Garrett had asked about 2 weeks ago with such careful, specific attention. She lifted it out, turned it over in her palm with the practiced ease of someone who has handled furniture pieces before, or who has spent enough time researching this specific object to know exactly how to hold it. She brought it closer to the window light, tilted it at a different angle. Her thumb moved across the underside of the top, feeling for something. She found the maker's mark area and examined it. I could see her lips move slightly as she read whatever was there, and then she read it again. I stepped into the doorway. The real ones have been in climate-controlled storage in Biltmore Village for 3 weeks, I said. My voice was level. The same tone I use when I am explaining a restoration to a customer. Not unkind, not accusatory, just accurate. The kind of voice that does not require a response because the information it carries is sufficient by itself. What you're holding is a copy I made myself. I know the difference between original and reproduction. So does anyone who actually understands wood. Sophie turned around. We looked at each other across the width of the room. The afternoon light came through the study window between us, falling on the open display case, on the replica table still in her hand, on the slight parting of her lips that was the beginning of a sentence she did not complete. There was nothing to say. I had known that before I stepped into the doorway. Whatever she might have offered, surprise, denial, some version of I was just looking, would have required me to engage with it, and I had no interest in that conversation. The facts were in her hand. The maker's mark on the underside told the story without either of us needing to narrate it. My mark. My initials. The letters FC with the date, stamped into the wood the way I stamp every piece I build. Because Della taught me that a man who does not sign his work does not fully own it. After a moment, Sophie looked down at the table in her hand. She placed it back on the felt shelf carefully. More carefully than she had picked it up, with a kind of deliberate precision that seemed in its way, like the only acknowledgement she was capable of making. She closed the glass panels. She smoothed the front of her shirt with both hands, a gesture that had nothing to do with her shirt. Then she walked to the doorway. I stepped aside. She went past me without speaking and without looking at me, and I heard her door close at the far end of the hallway. Not a slam. The soft, definitive click of a latch finding its seat. I stood in the study doorway for a moment. Through the window, the white oak moved slightly in an afternoon wind. I could not hear from inside. She had looked small walking away. I had not wanted to notice that. But a man who has spent his life reading the precise truth of small things does not get to choose what he sees. I went downstairs. The afternoon passed in the slow, heavy way that afternoons pass when a house is full of people who are not speaking to each other. I worked on the cherry cabinet in the workshop until the light changed. At 6:30, my phone buzzed on the bench. Catherine, 2 offers, Frank. First one came in this afternoon. Asking price, 30-day close, clean terms, pre-approved financing. A pause. Second one came in an hour ago, considerably above asking. I set down the chisel I was holding. The second buyer has requested a private meeting with you before finalizing. He said you would understand why when you heard his name. I waited. Elijah Crane. Catherine said. I stood in the workshop with the phone in my hand and the name in the air between the bench and the clocks on the wall. Elijah Crane. The man in the gray fleece jacket. The one who had stood in the workshop doorway that morning and read Della's sign twice and looked at the bench and the tools with an expression that had nothing to do with real estate. The name found its shape slowly. The way a grain pattern emerges when you sand through the surface, finish, and reach the raw wood underneath. Not all at once. In layers, I reached for it. I knew that name. I was certain I knew it. But I could not yet place where. I did not sleep well Thursday night. The name Elijah Crane moved through my thoughts the way a knot moves through a planer, catching, releasing, catching again. I knew the name. I knew it. The way you know the species of a board by its smell before you ever see the grain. But the memory would not surface, and by the time the first light crossed the workshop ceiling on Friday morning, I had stopped reaching for it and let it settle on its own. The day passed quietly. I finished the final sanding on a walnut jewelry box for a woman in West Asheville, wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with cotton string the way Della taught me, and set it on the bench for Monday delivery. Sophie stayed in her room most of the morning. Garrett left before 8 and did not return by noon, or by 3, or by the time the kitchen clock marked 5 with a soft, familiar chime that Della had chosen 21 years ago because she said it sounded like someone tapping a wine glass at dinner. At 6, I made a plate of bread, cheese, and sliced apple. I ate standing at the counter, looking through the window at the white oak in the side yard. Its leaves had turned the color of old varnish amber at the center, darker at the edges, curling slightly inward the way veneer curls when the moisture is wrong. I washed the plate, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. Then I went to the workshop and retrieved the white envelope from the second drawer. I had written the list by hand 4 days earlier, sitting at the same bench where I had repaired 600 pieces of furniture over 45 years. 12 years of entries. Each one documented a payment I had made to Sophie, or on her behalf. $1,200 in September of 20. 12 for a car repair she said was urgent. $840 in March of 2014 for a credit card balance she promised to repay by summer. $2,200 in November of 2015 for the first and last month on an apartment she occupied for 5 weeks before moving in with a boyfriend whose name I have since forgotten. The list continued through dentist bills, a laptop, 2 security deposits, a storage unit in Candler that turned out to hold nothing but empty boxes and a broken elliptical machine. $31,000 across a dozen years, none of it repaid. None of it acknowledged after the first week. On the last line I had written, October 20, 25. Caldwell Heritage Properties, LLC. Loan guarantee, forged signature. $55,000. I carried the envelope to the kitchen. The overhead light was off. I turned on the small brass lamp that sits on the counter near the stove, another piece Della chose, a 1950s pharmacy lamp, with a green glass shade that throws a circle of warm light no wider than a dinner plate. I set the envelope in the center of the kitchen table and sat down across from it. Sophie came downstairs at 9:12. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt and no shoes, and she paused at the bottom of the stairs, the way a person pauses when they see something in a room that was not there before. Her eyes found the envelope, then found me, then returned to the envelope. "Sit down," I said. She pulled out the chair opposite mine. The legs scraped against the heart pine floor, and I heard the sound the way I always hear it, not as noise but as contact, wood against wood, pressure and grain, and the tiny compression of fibers that have been bearing weight since before my daughter was born. "Open it," I said. She lifted the flap. It was still unsealed, exactly as I had left it. She removed the 2 pages and read the first one slowly. I watched her eyes move down the list. The way I watch a client's eyes move across a finished piece, looking for the flaw, the place where the work fails to meet expectation. She reached the bottom of the first page, turned to the second, and stopped. I knew which line she had found. Caldwell Heritage Properties, she read aloud. Her voice was flat, careful, the way a board sounds when you tap it and discover the inside is hollow. $55,000. A man named Paul Weston called me Tuesday evening, I said. He invested $55,000 in a company registered under our family name. My signature appears on the loan guarantee. It is not my signature. Sophie set the pages down on the table. She did not fold them. She did not push them away. She placed them flat, one on top of the other, and pressed her palm against them as though smoothing a wrinkle from cloth. "I did not sign that document," I said. "Thomas Redfield has examined the original. The stroke pattern is wrong. The F does not connect to the R. The C in Caldwell closes, where mine does not. He has prepared an affidavit and will file it with the county recorder before the property sale closes." She said nothing. Her hand remained on the pages. "Redfield will call you," I continued. "He will also call Garrett. He will explain what happens when a forged signature is reported to the North Carolina Secretary of State. I wanted you to see the list first, before anyone else speaks to you." Because the list is not a legal document. It is a record. It is what I remember, and what I can prove, and what I have carried quietly for 12 years, because I believed silence was the same as kindness. I paused. The brass lamp hummed the way old transformers do, a sound so faint you only hear it when every other sound has stopped. I was wrong about that, I said. Sophie withdrew her hand from the pages. She stood, pushed the chair back slowly, and walked toward the stairs without turning around. Her footsteps were soft on the pine bare feet. No weight. As though she were trying to leave the smallest possible impression on a floor her father built. I sat with the envelope and the lamp and the silence for a long time after that. Somewhere upstairs a door closed, not loudly, not gently, but with the particular sound of wood meeting wood when neither side has anything left to say. The brass lamp kept its small circle of light on the table. The pages lay where she had left them. I did not move them. Some joints hold for 100 years. Some fail the first season. You cannot always tell which is which until the wait arrives. Saturday morning arrived the way it always does in late October in Asheville, slowly, with fog sitting low against the ridge and the white oak holding still as though the air itself had thickened overnight. I was in the workshop by 6, not because there was work to finish, but because the bench is where I think best, and I had been thinking since 3:15 when I woke to the sound of a door opening and closing somewhere above me. I did not go upstairs to check. Some sounds in a house tell you everything you need to know without requiring you to see what made them. By 7 I had swept the floor, reorganized the clamp rack, and sharpened 2 chisels that did not need sharpening. Della used to call this nervous tidying, and she was right. When my hands cannot solve the problem in front of them, they solve the nearest problem they can find. It is not courage, it is habit, and habit is what a man relies on when courage has not yet arrived. At 8:41 my phone rang. Thomas Redfield's number appeared on the screen, and I answered on the second ring. "I spoke with your daughter at 7 this morning," he said. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who has delivered difficult information professionally for 30 years. She listened. She did not interrupt. She asked one question at the end. What question? She asked whether the affidavit would include Garrett's name. I set down the chisel I had been holding. What did you tell her? I told her the affidavit names every individual associated with the Caldwell Heritage Properties filing. Garrett Townsend is listed as the registered agent. His name appears on the Articles of Organization, the operating agreement, and the bank account signature card. The only document bearing your name is the loan guarantee. And that signature is forged. I exhaled slowly through my nose. It was the kind of breath you take when you have suspected something for a long time. And the confirmation arrives, not as a shock, but as a weight finally settling onto a shelf you built to hold it. She was quiet after that, Redfield continued. Then she thanked me and hung up. I thanked him as well. He reminded me that the affidavit would be filed Monday morning, and that I should expect a call from the county recorder's office within the week. I told him I understood, and the line went silent. For the next 2 hours I sat in the workshop and did nothing useful. I looked at Della's sign above the door, Caldwell and Craft Fine Restoration, and I thought about the afternoon she carved it. She had used a 1/4-inch gouge and a mallet, working the letters into a slab of white oak she had chosen herself from a mill in Leicester. The ampersand gave her trouble. She recut it twice before she was satisfied. And when I asked her why she did not simply use a template, she said, because a template would make it accurate. I want it to be true. That was Della. She understood the difference between accurate and true. The way most people understand the difference between hot and cold instinctively, without needing to explain it. At 11:14, I heard footsteps on the main staircase. Not Sophie's. These were heavier, faster, and they carried the particular rhythm of a man descending an anger heel, striking hard, weight forward, no pause at the landing. Garrett. I stepped out of the workshop into the back hallway. From where I stood, I could see the bottom of the staircase through the kitchen doorway. The oak stairs I had built in 1996, replacing the original pine treads that had cracked after 112 years of use. I milled each step from quarter-sawn white oak, fitted them with hand-cut dovetail joints at the stringer, and finished them with 4 coats of tung oil rubbed by hand until the grain glowed like river stone in afternoon light. Della sat on the top step and watched me work for 3 days. She said the sound of a hand plane on oak was the closest thing to music our house ever made. Garrett reached the 4th step from the bottom. I heard his voice first sharp, directed upward, saying something to Sophie that I could not fully distinguish, except for the word lawyer and the phrase, "This is your father's doing." Then his right foot came down on the 3rd step, and something happened that I have replayed in my mind many times since. The step did not fail. I want to be clear about that. I built those stairs to hold 4 times their expected load, and they have not shifted a 1/4 of an inch in 30 years. What failed was Garrett's balance. His heel struck the tread at an angle. His weight moved forward faster than his foot could follow, and his left hand reached for the banister, but found only air because he was carrying his phone in that hand and did not release it in time. He fell forward. His body turned slightly as he dropped, and his right wrist struck the newel post at the bottom of the staircase, the same newel post I had turned on a lathe from a single piece of cherry, shaped to match the original 1891 design, sanded to 320 grit, and sealed with 6 coats of lacquer that Della said made it look like dark honey. The sound was brief and wrong. Not wood-breaking. Something softer. Sharper, the sound of bone meeting a surface that will not yield. Sophie screamed from upstairs. I heard her footsteps cross the landing and descend quickly. By the time I reached the front hallway, Garrett was sitting on the floor at the base of the stairs, his right wrist held against his chest at an angle that no wrist should hold. His face was white. His phone lay 2 feet away on the heart pine floor, its screen cracked in a pattern that looked, to my eye, like the checking you see in wood that has dried too fast. Sophie knelt beside him. She looked up at me once, and in that look I saw something I had not seen from my daughter in a very long time. Not anger, not calculation, not the careful management of a situation, but fear. Plain, unguarded fear. "Call an ambulance," she said. I did. I gave the address 1847 Montfort Avenue and described the injury as a possible wrist fracture from a fall on an interior staircase. The dispatcher said 7 minutes. It took 9. I stood in the hallway while they loaded Garrett onto a stretcher. Sophie rode with him. She did not ask me to come, and I did not offer. The ambulance pulled away from the curb at 11:31, and within 2 minutes Montfort Avenue was quiet again. The way it always is on a Saturday before noon, just the sound of wind in the oak, and, somewhere down the block, a neighbor's wind chime turning slowly in air that smelled like wet leaves and coming rain. I went back inside. The newel post was undamaged. I checked it with my hand, running my fingers over the cherry surface the way I check every joint I have ever made by touch, slowly, looking for the flaw that the eye might miss. There was none. The wood had held. The wood always holds, when the work is honest. I closed the front door and returned to the workshop. Della's notebook sat on the shelf where it had been sitting for 7 years. And for the first time since Thursday night, I thought not about whether to open it, but about when. I did not go to the hospital Saturday afternoon. I sat in the workshop until the light moved from the east windows to the west and then faded entirely. And I did not go. It was not anger that kept me in that chair, though anger would have been easy and perhaps even justified. It was something quieter than anger. A recognition, slow and heavy, that my presence in that hospital room would change nothing and comfort no one, least of all myself. Sophie called once. At 4:17. She said Garrett's wrist was fractured in 2 places, a distal radius and a scaphoid, and that surgery was scheduled for Sunday morning. She said the word surgery the way a person says a word they have only recently learned, carefully, as though mispronouncing it might change the outcome. I told her I was glad it was not worse. She paused. And in that pause, I heard the full distance between us measured not in miles, but in years of things unsaid. Then she asked if I would come tomorrow. "I will come in the morning," I said. And I meant it. Sunday. I drove to Mission Hospital at 8:15, parked in the east lot, and walked through the main entrance carrying nothing. I had considered bringing something, a book, a small carving, the kind of gesture a father makes when he does not know what else to offer but decided against it. Some rooms you enter with empty hands because empty hands are the only honest thing you have left. Room 214 was on the second floor, east wing. The hallway smelled like every hospital hallway I have ever known, disinfectant and recycled air, and the faint, sad sweetness of flowers beginning to turn. Sophie was sitting in a vinyl chair beside the window, still wearing the gray sweatshirt from Friday night. Garrett lay in the bed with his right arm elevated in a temporary splint, his face slack from medication, his eyes half open but unfocused. He looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a man who had run out of answers. Sophie stood when I entered. She did not move toward me. She stood the way a board stands when you lean it against a wall upright, but unsupported, waiting for something to either hold it in place or let it fall. "How is he?" I asked. "They are operating at 10, she said. 2 pins. Maybe 3. I nodded. I looked at Garrett, then at the window, then at my daughter. The light from outside was thin and gray, filtered through clouds that had been sitting over the Blue Ridge since Friday, and it fell across Sophie's face in a way that made her look younger than 35, closer to the girl who used to sit on the workshop floor sorting wood shavings by color while Della sanded a tabletop 3 feet away. I sat down in the second chair, the one nearest the door. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The monitors beeped at intervals that were too regular to be comforting and too quiet to ignore. A nurse entered, checked the IV line, made a note on a tablet, and left without looking at either of us. The room returned to its particular silence, the silence of a place where people wait for things they cannot control. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out Della's notebook. I had carried it from the workshop shelf that morning for the first time in 7 years. The leather was dark and soft from age, and the binding cracked faintly when I opened it, the way old glue cracks when the joint is stressed for the first time in a long while. Della's handwriting filled the first page, small, precise, slanting slightly to the right, each letter formed with the same care she gave to every piece of wood she ever touched. The first entry was dated 8 years before she died. It read, "Frank will not ask for help. He will sand the same board until there is nothing left. That is his flaw. That is also his strength. I am writing this because one day someone will need to tell him the difference." I turned the page. The second entry was shorter. "The house is his. The workshop is his. The children are ours. But the house is his. And he must remember that when the time comes to choose between keeping it and keeping himself." I read 5 pages in that hospital room. I read them slowly, the way you read grain, following the direction, noting where it curves, where it tightens, where the figure emerges from what looked at first like ordinary wood. Della had written about the children. She had written about the house. She had written about me, and on the 6th page, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, as though her hand had trembled or the pen had paused too long between words, she had written the line I had seen on the cover 7 years ago without understanding it. "For Frank, when the wood starts splitting, let the grain run the way it was always meant to. Do not force it. Do not sand it down to nothing. Set down the chisel when the shape is clear, even if it is not the shape you planned." I closed the notebook. My hands were still. The tremor that had followed me for 3 years was absent, or perhaps I simply could not feel it beneath the weight of what I had just read. Sophie was watching me. I do not know how long she had been watching, but when I looked up, her eyes were wet, and her lips were pressed together in a line that was not anger and not control, but the thin edge of something breaking that had been held together too long. "Dad," she said. Just that. Just the word. I cannot build you a life, Sophie, I said. I have spent 45 years building things for other people. Chairs, tables, cabinets, staircases, a house, a business, a name. I built them well. I built them to last. But I cannot build you a life. That was never something my hands could do, no matter how steady they were. She did not answer. A tear moved down her left cheek, following a line as straight and inevitable as a crack in dry maple. Your mother knew that, I said. She wrote it down because she knew I would need to read it before I could say it. I placed the notebook on my knee and rested both hands on top of it. Outside the window, the clouds over the Blue Ridge had thinned just enough to let a single band of light pass through, pale and brief, touching the parking lot in the row of bare dogwoods along the hospital entrance before disappearing again. Garrett shifted in the bed. His eyes opened fully for a moment, found the ceiling, then closed. The monitor beeped. The room held its breath. Redfield files the affidavit tomorrow, I said quietly. What happens after that is between you and the law, and whatever you decide to build with your own hands. I will not stand in your way, but I will not carry you either. Not anymore. Sophie wiped her face with the back of her hand. She nodded once, a small, careful movement, like the first tap of a chisel on a line you have measured 3 times, and know is right. I stood, put the notebook back in my jacket pocket, and walked to the door. I did not look back, not because I did not love my daughter, but because love, when it is honest, sometimes looks exactly like a man walking out of a room with nothing in his hands but a notebook and the quiet certainty that the grain, at last, is running the way it was always meant to. Monday came with the kind of clarity that sometimes follows a long stretch of cloud-sharp light, cold air, the mountains visible from every window in the house, as though someone had wiped a cloth across the sky overnight and left nothing behind but blue and distance. I stood at the kitchen sink at 6 in the morning and drank a glass of water and looked at the white oak in the side yard and thought about how many Mondays I had begun exactly this way, in this kitchen, at this sink, with this view, and how few of them I had left in this house. The thought did not hurt the way I expected. It arrived the way a measurement arrives, factual, precise, neither kind nor unkind. This house was mine. It had been mine since Della and I signed the closing papers 31 years ago, standing in a title office on Patton Avenue, with ink still wet on our fingers, and a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have for 2 pieces of brass. And it would be mine until the moment I signed it away, which, if the morning went as planned, would happen before noon. Thomas Redfield arrived at 8:45. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase that I had seen many times. Over 15 years, the same briefcase he had carried the day he helped Della draft her will, the day he filed the deed transfer after she passed, and now today, the day he would witness the end of a house that had held a family together for 3 decades and had, in the last year, failed to hold it any longer. He set the briefcase on the kitchen table, the same table where the envelope had lain Friday night, and removed a stack of documents held together with a single black binder clip. The affidavit was filed at 8:02 this morning, he said. The county recorder's office has it on record. A copy has been sent to Caldwell Heritage Properties registered agent, which is Garrett Townsend, and a second copy to the North Carolina Secretary of State's office for review. I nodded. It was done. The signature that was not mine had been formally declared not mine, and whatever followed legal proceedings, creditor claims, the slow unwinding of a company built on a borrowed name, would follow its own course without requiring my hands to guide it. Catherine Mercer arrived at 9:15. She parked the gray Volvo in the same spot she had used on her first visit, just past the white oak, in the shade that Della used to say was the only free air conditioning in Montford. Catherine carried a portfolio and a pen and a printed copy of the purchase agreement. She shook Redfield's hand, then mine, and set her materials beside his on the kitchen table. We have one buyer, she said. Elijah Crane, He has waived inspection contingency, accepted the property as is, and agreed to the 30-day closing schedule. The offer is above asking. She stated the number. $685,000. I heard it. The way I hear the price of a piece of wood at the mill as information, as material, as something that becomes meaningful only when you know what you intend to build with it. There is one additional term, Catherine continued. She opened the portfolio to a single page, typed neatly, with a handwritten note at the bottom. Mr. Crane has requested that the workshop remain operational as a teaching space for woodworking apprentices. He has proposed a lease agreement, $1 per year, indefinite term, with the condition that the current occupant, meaning you, Frank, retains full use for as long as you wish. I read the handwritten note. The writing was neat and angular, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned to write with care and has not forgotten it. It said, Mr. Caldwell taught me to read grain when I was 17. I would like the workshop to continue teaching others. This is not charity. This is maintenance. And then I remembered, Elijah Crane, 17 years old, Youth Build Asheville, the summer of 2008. A tall boy with serious eyes and hands too large for his wrists, assigned to my station for 6 weeks of furniture restoration basics. He barely spoke. He listened. He watched my hands the way an apprentice watches, not to copy the movement, but to understand the reason behind it. On his last day, he asked me a single question. How do you know when a piece is finished? And I told him what Della had told me years before. 17 years. He had been 17, and now he was 41, and he had walked through my workshop door 2 days ago in a gray fleece jacket and read Della's sign twice and said nothing because he already understood everything the sign meant. I set the note down. I looked at Redfield. I looked at Catherine. Then I picked up the pen and signed the purchase agreement on the line marked seller, writing my name the way I have always written it. Franklin, James Caldwell, with the F flowing into the R without lifting, the way ink moves on wood when the hand behind it knows exactly where it is going. Now, I said, I would like to discuss the proceeds. Redfield opened a second document. I had outlined the terms to him by phone Saturday evening, and he had prepared the paperwork overnight. 70% of the net proceeds after closing costs. Redfield's fee and Catherine's commission would be placed in a charitable trust dedicated to the preservation and restoration of antique woodwork in western North Carolina. The trust would fund apprenticeships, tool grants, and workshop space for young craftspeople who, like Elijah, had found their way to wood before the world had told them what else to do with their hands. The remaining 30% would go into a restricted account in Sophie's name. The conditions were simple and non-negotiable. She could access the funds only after maintaining steady employment for 2 consecutive years, verified quarterly by Redfield's office. If the condition was not met, the funds would roll into the charitable trust at the end of the 2-year period. No extensions. No exceptions. She will not like the conditions, Redfield said. She does not have to like them, I said. She has to meet them. Catherine gathered the signed documents into her portfolio. Redfield placed his copies in the briefcase. We shook hands, 3 people standing in a kitchen that smelled faintly of old wood and brass polish, and the ghost of every meal Della had ever cooked on the stove 4 feet away. Catherine left first. Redfield paused at the door and looked back at me. Della would have approved of this, he said. Della would have done it faster, I replied. He smiled, the first smile I had seen from Thomas Redfield in 15 years of acquaintance, and closed the door behind him. I stood alone in the kitchen. The brass pharmacy lamp was off. The morning light filled the room without assistance. Touching the counters, the cabinets, the heart pine floor, and the single empty chair at the table where Sophie had sat Friday night, reading a list of 12 years. The house was quiet. The oak outside the window held still. Somewhere in a hospital 7 minutes away, a man with a broken wrist was waking from surgery. And somewhere in a vinyl chair beside him, my daughter was beginning to understand that the floor beneath her had always belonged to someone else. I placed my hands flat on the kitchen table, the same hands Sophie had called a caretaker's hands. The same hands Garrett had watched with calculation. The same hands Della had held on the night she told me the house was mine and I must remember it. I pressed them against the wood and felt the grain run true beneath my palms, straight and even. The way it runs in a board that was dried slowly and stored well, and never asked to be anything other than what it was. The last box was smaller than I expected. It held a set of carving gouges wrapped in oilcloth. A photograph of Della, standing beside the white oak on the day we moved in, and the brass pharmacy lamp with the green glass shade that had sat on the kitchen counter for 21 years. I taped the box shut, wrote "Workshop Fragile" on the top in pencil, and set it beside the front door with the others. 11 boxes, 45 years of living in a house, and what I chose to keep fit into 11 boxes, and the bed of a borrowed pickup truck. It was the first Wednesday of November. The closing had been finalized the previous afternoon at Catherine Mercer's office on Haywood Street. Signatures, notarized stamps, wire transfers, and a set of keys passed across a table from my hand to Elijah Crane's. His hand was steady when he took them. He turned the keys once, looked at them the way a man looks at something he intends to care for, and placed them in his jacket pocket without ceremony. Catherine shook both our hands. Redfield witnessed the final document and left with his briefcase. The whole thing took 40 minutes. 31 years of ownership, concluded in less time than it takes to glue and clamp a drawer joint. Elijah walked me to my truck afterward. We stood in the parking lot on Haywood Street, and he said, "The workshop will be ready when you want to come back. I am having the wiring inspected next week and the roof patched before the first snow." "The roof has a soft spot above the northeast corner," I said. "Has had one since 2014. I kept meaning to fix it." "I know," he said. "I saw it Thursday when I looked up from the bench." I nodded. He had seen it from inside the workshop, which meant he had looked at the ceiling the way I taught him to look at wood. Not just at the surface, but at what the surface was telling you about what lay behind it. 17 years. And the boy still read a room the way he read grain. I drove back to Montfort Avenue for the last time. The white oak had dropped most of its leaves by then, and they lay across the front yard in a pattern that looked, from the truck window, like the figure in a piece of quarter-sawn maple, irregular, repeating, beautiful without trying to be. I parked in the driveway, walked through the front door, and began carrying boxes to the truck. Sophie was not there. She had left Sunday evening with a single suitcase and driven east to Black Mountain, where a woman she had known in college offered her a room and a part-time position at a small retail shop that sold handmade pottery and woven goods. She had told me this by text message, 3 short sentences, no punctuation errors, no emotion, no request for approval. I read it twice and replied with 4 words. "That is a start." It was the most honest thing I could say, and I believe she understood it, because she did not reply, and silence between us had begun, at last, to mean something other than avoidance. Garrett I had not spoken to since the hospital. Redfield informed me that the affidavit had triggered a preliminary inquiry by the Secretary of State's office into Caldwell Heritage Properties LLC, and that Paul Weston's attorney had filed a separate complaint regarding the $55,000 investment. Garrett's name appeared on every relevant document except the one that bore my forged signature. What happened next was between him and the law and the 4 investors whose money had passed through a company that existed for 6 months and produced nothing. I did not wish him harm. I did not wish him well. I wished him the experience of building something with his own hands and discovering whether it held. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted cotton warehouse in the River Arts District, overlooking the French Broad River. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, wide plank floors that someone had refinished recently with polyurethane, not my preference, but adequate, and a row of tall windows facing west. The landlord, a ceramic artist named Joan who occupied the studio below, had left a note on the counter that said, "Welcome. Hot water takes 90 seconds. Do not trust the back burner." I carried the boxes up the stairs one at a time. I placed the carving gouges on the kitchen counter, hung Della's photograph on a nail beside the bedroom door, and set the brass pharmacy lamp on the small table by the window. When I plugged it in and turned the switch, it threw the same circle of warm light it had always thrown, no wider than a dinner plate, no brighter than necessary, exactly enough to read by or to sit beside in silence. The last thing I unpacked was the china cabinet. Not a full-size cabinet, I did not have room for that, but a small display piece I had built for Della 18 years ago from figured cherry, with glass panels and hand-cut dovetails, and a back panel of aromatic cedar that still, after nearly 2 decades, released its scent when the door was opened. Della had kept her mother's teacups in it. I kept it empty now, but I set it against the wall beside the window because it was the finest piece of joinery I had ever made, and because Della had once said it was the only piece of furniture in the house that made her want to stand still and look. I sat in the single chair by the window and watched the French Broad move below. The river was high from the October rains, brown and steady, carrying leaves and small branches south toward Brevard and beyond. The sun was low, and the light on the water was the color of aged maple, warm, golden, with depth beneath the surface that you could sense but not see. Somewhere downriver a train sounded its horn, long and fading, the way all good sounds fade not into silence but into distance, which is a different thing entirely. I took Della's notebook from my jacket pocket and held it in both hands. I did not open it. I had read what I needed to read in the hospital room, and the words were inside me now. Settled into the grain, the way stain settles into wood. Not sitting on the surface, but absorbed. Part of the structure, impossible to sand away without removing the wood itself. Let the grain run the way it was always meant to. I set the notebook on the table beside the lamp. The leather caught the green-tinted light from the shade and glowed faintly, the way cherry glows after its 6th coat of finish, not shining but alive, holding the light rather than reflecting it. My phone buzzed once. A text from Sophie. It said, "Started Monday." The owner showed me how to wrap ceramics for shipping. My hands smelled like newspaper and clay all day. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone beside the notebook and looked out the window at the river and the last thin line of light above the ridge. The mountains were going dark the way they always do in November, slowly, from the top down, as though the sky were drawing a curtain across them, one ridge at a time. My hands rested on my knees. They were still. The tremor that had followed me for 3 years was quiet. Not gone, but quiet. The way a house is quiet after everyone has left, and the wood has stopped settling, and the only sound is the sound of the structure itself, holding. I had built what I could build. I had kept what was worth keeping. I had let go of what was never mine to hold. And in the morning I would walk down the stairs and across the street to the river and begin again. The way a craftsman always begins, with steady hands, clean wood, and the knowledge that the grain, once you learn to read it, will tell you everything you need to know.